Hey everyone, Bruce Eckfeldt here. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Make sure that you subscribe and turn on notifications so we can let you know when the next video is posted. You can also check us out at eckfeldt.com for more great content. With that, let's go check out the video.
Are you a CEO looking to scale your company faster and easier? Check out Thrive Roundtable. Thrive combines a moderated peer group mastermind, expert one-on-one coaching, access to proven growth tools, and a 24/7 support community. Created by Inc. award-winning CEO and certified scaling up business coach Bruce Eckfeldt, Thrive will help you grow your business more quickly and with less drama. For details on the program, visit eckfeldt.com/thrive. That's eckfeldt.com/thrive.
You're listening to Thinking Outside the Bud, where we speak with entrepreneurs, investors, thought leaders, researchers, advocates, and policymakers who are finding new and exciting ways for cannabis to positively impact business, society, and culture. And now, here is your host, business coach, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome everyone, this is Thinking Outside the Bud. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt, I'm your host. And our guest today is Gia Moron, and she is Executive Vice President at Women Grow. And we're going to find out a little bit more about her and about the organization. And I'm really excited about this. I'm excited to talk about cannabis. I'm excited to talk about diversity. I'm talk about what the community is around the cannabis space. Gia, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me on today. I really, really appreciate it. And it's finally great to hear your voice. We've exchanged messages for a while. It's really great to connect with you.
Yeah, no, Gia and I have been stalking each other over the last couple of months, trying to get her on the program, and I really appreciate your time on here. Why don't we start with a little bit about you? So tell us about your background. Like, I know you kind of came out of the more kind of corporate space. I'd love to hear about that, and then how you got into cannabis. What was the story?
Sure. So I've had, I guess I'd say, a diverse career. I started out in corporate entertainment in the television industry in an international distribution and production company. So I worked on shows like, this is really going back to the 90s, like Baywatch. Like, I don't know how many people remember Baywatch.
David Hasselhoff going down the beach, yeah.
Exactly. David Hasselhoff and Pam Anderson and Nicole Eckert. So I worked with the production and distribution of shows like that overseas. So I worked with Latin American countries, Asian countries, and Canada. So, it was really interesting to get that kind of global perspective as I started out in my career. And I eventually became the director of promotions and publicity, again, working with evening shows, game shows. I worked on award shows. So it was really fun. It was a natural progression. And I thought that I would remain in entertainment. And just through some downsizing, I actually found myself on Wall Street, which I would have never thought.
Yeah.
I've always been more of a drawn to the entertainment space and PR within that industry. And in 96, I landed on Wall Street at Goldman Sachs, and I thought, I'm just going to be here for a little while. This is not going to be anything long term, because I just didn't have that interest. But what I quickly realized is that PR, promotions, publicity, it's just a different industry, but it's the same practices, right? We're putting out press releases, you're advising clients, and I probably had the best education for 15 years on Wall Street. I experienced pretty much everything in connection through one company. Because when I joined Goldman Sachs, it was a private company in 96. They went public in 96. So I actually went through that process with them. And then much later on, they kind of become like this commercial bank. And then I experienced the financial crisis with them. So it was like so much education that no classroom could have taught me what I learned on Wall Street. And I not only worked on the revenue generating side, but I really got to understand how corporations run. And I think oftentimes when people think of investment banking, they only think of the banking side and not recognizing that there's so much more to these businesses. So I worked a lot on the diversity and inclusion group. I worked with the recruiting departments at Goldman, their overall corporate services. So I got to understand what global security meant. I had no idea. So when I say full-on education, it was incredible. So for me, I was able to take a lot of that experience with me and bring it along the way, and also, of course, learn a lot about the markets.
Yeah, it sounds like good training for how businesses run, how markets run, how industries run.
Absolutely.
So how did cannabis come up? So you're Wall Street, you're working for Goldman Sachs. How do we get to where you are today? Fill in the steps.
That part is interesting. So again, being affected by another downsize, so in 2011, there was another downsize happening across the street. And believe it or not, I was actually the spokesperson, like really commenting on what was happening. And I was actually affected by it. It wasn't anything personal. It's, hey, you guys have been, whomever that kind of started around that same time, I kind of noticed we'd all received our, layoff information. So that's when I thought about, what would I like to do next? I've been a working mom my entire career, and I'd never been home, like ever. I went back to work when my daughter was 5 weeks old.
Wow.
And I hadn't taken vacation anything longer than a week.
Yeah.
And that pretty much that 20-something year span. So it was my first time saying, well, let me stay home for a little while instead of jumping right back in to the industry. And what I had been noodling with prior to the layoff was really starting my own consulting firm. I was just reaching that point of I've had a lot of experience, and the beauty of working within financial services is I got to work on the tech side.
Yeah, sure.
I got to work with the philanthropic area, private equity, you name it. Like I really had a wide exposure. So I thought, well, what would I do next? And so being home my daughter's senior year of high school, which crazy enough, I'd always said if I had to be home, I'd want to be home her last year of school, just to help her through that college process. Yeah. And voila, it happened. Power of the universe. So
manifestation.
Totally. Yeah. And without even knowing that's what I did, but it is exactly what I did. Yeah. And then I was laid off September 2011. Okay. And after being home for quite some time, I decided I wanted to launch my own PR firm. And there was a lot of clients and former colleagues that I had worked with at Goldman that said, hey, what are you doing? Like, we'd love to work with you in some capacity. And that's where the seed was sort of planted. Like, well, why not now if not any other time? If this doesn't work out, I can always go back to corporate, but why not give this a chance? Yep. And so April 2012, I launched GVM Communications. And of course, reconnecting with many of the financial companies I was working with, also a lot of the nonprofits. What was wonderful is that, these big corporations have strong relationships with many nonprofits across the world. And what was wonderful is Goldman Sachs also had a program called 10,000 Women and 10,000 Small Businesses. Yep. And what I learned through that is that what we did on a grand scale for a big corporation, these small companies really needed our advice and our services. So that's when I realized, let me start connecting with some of these entrepreneurs and small businesses and offer my services. And that was really the natural progression of becoming my own quote unquote entrepreneur in business. And it was during the time of doing some work for colleagues. I'm considering, what outlets to pitch them to, what sorts of business direction could some of them go, because my business focus on public relations, branding, and business development, as well as just some coaching like yourself. Yep. So in doing the research, I started noticing on CNBC around 2012, the documentaries on the marijuana industry. And that completely paused me because I'm like, why is BBC talking about weed? That was my natural reaction. Like, why are they talking about weed? And they're it's not just one show. It's like a series of shows. And I just got sucked in immediately. And then that was also a flag for me to say, if they're that's where my television experience comes in, because I understand how much production costs. Yeah. And if it was one episode, I would say, they're just, toying with it. Yeah. A series of episodes means that there's a commitment. Those serious dollars, that's serious, really just pitching to the higher ups to get the sign off. So that for me, plus the Wall Street experience, told me, okay, this is something I need to pay attention to the forecast.
Yeah.
If they're talking about it, then I noticed Bloomberg started talking about it. And I said, oh, financial markets talking about it. I need to pay attention what's happening. And still not really understanding the lay of the land, but knew that if this was next, I wanted to be a part of it.
Yeah.
And so everything was focused on Colorado. And I'm thinking, oh, my God, I'm in New York. Am I going to have to move to Colorado? I'm in New York. I have never owned a single living plant. Am I going to go and try and open up?
The classic reaction. Everyone's like, oh my gosh, I'm going to become a grower.
So, right. Let me go grow something. Let me go open up a dispensary. And I've never, ever, I started working at the age of 13. And what's interesting is I've always worked in an office.
Yeah.
I never had a job at a McDonald's or any sort of retail space.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking I would be awful. I have no idea how to do this. And I mean, of course that's the natural reaction. But what I knew was that if the financial markets, as I said, were paying attention, I needed to pay attention to it.
Smart.
And the more that I started talking to people, they really thought it was a fad. And to me, something said, no, this is more than that. And I know that you recently spoke with Jane West, the founder of Women Grow.
Yeah.
And again, back to the universe sort of aligning and leading us. So it was after watching CNBC that I saw a profile on Jane West in a magazine that I was pitching for a client who eventually ended up on the cover of that magazine. But in the profile on Jane, I read it from cover to cover because I remembered seeing her in the 2020 special when they first started talking about cannabis. And I said, that's that lady. Yeah. And so I had to find out everything about her. And that's what led me to Women Grow. That's what led me into the cannabis industry because I said, oh, my God, now there are women in this space because everything in the documentary really focused on men's businesses. And when I saw Jane, I was like, oh, there's a place for me.
I like the story. And honestly, I think, every story is unique, but I think there's been a common theme in a lot of the people that I speak to, which is they're in another industry and they have an expertise, they have a skill, they have a capability that they see an opportunity to apply to the cannabis space. And so they make the move, they make the pivot. And there's always some adjustment, there's always some kind of strategy in how they're going to do it. But I think I've seen a lot of people be successful in the cannabis space, not by becoming growers or, becoming dispensaries or extractors or, actually handling the plant, but taking what they do extremely well and just applying it to the needs in the cannabis industry. So this idea of taking PR, taking communication, community development and applying it to cannabis, because cannabis is an industry. It needs all these things. And I think it's a lot of people don't kind of appreciate that or realize it when they first come into it, but that is really where the big kind of opportunities, new places for innovation and business growth are. So I think it makes a lot of sense. I think it's smart. I think, good move for you in terms of getting into this.
Thank you. And honestly, I would say it was after my first Women Grow meeting that I attended in 2000, mid to late 2015, that I found a location here in Manhattan. When I walked into this room, I was shocked. I could not believe how crowded the room was. It was in this really cool loft in New York City. And I walked in thinking, how did all these people know about this?
Yeah.
This is happening in one of the biggest cities in the world. Yeah. And I mentioned the meeting and no one I spoke to knew about it. But when I arrived, it was wall to wall people. And I thought, oh my God, this is one of those need to know, invite kind of things. But I knew at that point, I had to be in the right place. And it was that day that I got my first 3 clients in cannabis that I realized then, because I walked in thinking I needed to open a dispensary or cultivation. And someone said, no, you don't. And they asked me what I did. And I told them what I did. And they said, oh, wait, they took me by the hand. They introduced me to one person who introduced me to another. And by the time I left that meeting, I had 3 clients.
Yeah, great. I love that story because I love it. Just proves the point of how diverse the community is in terms of needs, in terms of skill sets, how I think effective it is as a community. I mean, one of the things I've loved about the cannabis community and the cannabis culture is it is a strong networking organization. Like people in the cannabis business know that they need to connect with other people that know the business in other domains and do referrals and make introductions. And it's growing so quickly that there's just so much opportunity in here. And having that kind of abundancy mindset is really, really powerful. So
no, it's a valid point. Well, one of the reasons why, and this is what I learned early on, is there was still stigma around it, even for those that were in the industry. Right. And the only way to somewhat get business done was through referral. Right. Yeah. Because unfortunately, it was still operating like the Wild West. So people valued that word of mouth, that referral experience. Also, there was no advertising. No one's marketing. No one can really, truly market their services. So the networking circles were really important to many of us who were starting out in 2015, 2016, because that's really all we had. And most of the existing circles we were operating in were not familiar with cannabis, mostly, other than for recreational use, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
But in terms of business, they weren't looking at it on the same landscape.
Yeah, I think that's an important sort of dynamic of the industry, is that you have a lot of, I guess, places where most industry or most business folks would go to kind of network and get information and things like that. Oftentimes, those were actually specifically prohibiting the cannabis industry for some very legitimate reasons, some not so legitimate. But it did, and it's still that way to some extent. Although in Vegas we had 27,000 people at MJBizCon. So
but you think about that though. Yeah. You think about MJBizCon last year and the year before versus this year, and so when you think about those earlier networking circles, they were smaller, but over a course of a year, they really started growing and they started getting bigger and bigger. And it's the same thing with the industry versus mainstream. The more and more media started bringing attention to the industry is where the other industries are now saying, oh, maybe we need to start considering what this could look like for us.
Yeah. I'm curious, you mentioned something a minute ago. You talked about the stigma around the industry and stuff. I'm always curious to what extent did you have challenges, issues with your kind of professional circles, colleagues, things like that, when you started to kind of come out as a pro-cannabis professional?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good
question. Did that come up? I find that some people, it's a really big issue. Other people didn't. What was your experience?
Absolutely, I did. So first and foremost, when I made the decision to jump fully in, because I was really on the sidelines from 2012 until 2015, I had the conversation with my family and I said, this is what I'm doing. And I wanted to be mindful of my daughter, although at the time in college, and it sounded cool, right? Yeah. Like, oh, my mom's in the weed industry, and that's what she'd say, except she really didn't want to promote that either, because then you don't want to be labeled, or you don't want your parent to be labeled as a drug dealer, right? So I was very mindful about the comfortability of my family and respecting that I didn't want to put them in sort of compromising positions. But no matter what, I was still moving forward. Yep. Then when I talk about, let's say, my former colleagues, especially those on Wall Street, that started hearing me talk about it a little bit more. And of course, I think the natural, reaction are the sort of jokes, right? People had, and we laugh about it, but I don't think at the time they realized how serious I was about it. And the more that I began talking about it, they said, oh, she's serious. And I felt a little bit of a distance there. But it was a distance of, I'm going to stand on the sidelines and just watch what she does. And what I can appreciate about former colleagues and friends is that anything I've ever done, whether if it's a win or a fail, they knew I was committed to it and I gave it a lot of thought, right? It wasn't just something I didn't haphazardly just jump into something because I thought it was fun. It was, I've done my research and I'm taking this seriously. And I think for those former colleagues of mine, I remember one coming to me from my former employer, and I was very conscious because I knew that they were very selective about where their name appeared. And I knew that given my resume that the investment bank I worked for, that would come up. So instead of mentioning them in an article, I just said I worked for a financial services institution. And the response was, why didn't you mention us in the article? I thought, you wanted to be in this article? You wanted to be mentioned? And I was surprised because I figured you wouldn't want any association. Yeah. But that's when I realized, okay, you've watched enough.
Yeah.
You're watching, and you're less concerned about the stigma around the industry versus where it's going. And I'd say the same for family and friends and either, extended colleagues. They're now okay with it, where they were a little apprehensive before. And I think also part of it is the natural reactions. People thought I was a consumer, and I am, but not to the degree of what natural consumers are seeing, right? Yeah. So I'm a former cigarette smoker, so I'm anti-smoking pretty much overall, right? My smoking is my vice, and so I'm not going to pick up a joint.
Yeah.
Now, that isn't to say that I haven't tried it a few times since being in the industry. Uh-huh. I'm not anti-smoking. It's just, it doesn't work for me.
No, your personal choice is not that, yeah.
My personal choice. So my personal choices are CBD tinctures. Yep. I enjoy more of like the savory edible, so like some teas with low THC. Yeah. I'm a huge product user of anything cannabis and CBD infused because of like my joint pains or something like that. So when I started explaining to colleagues that cannabis, the industry is more than these, joints or bongs that they see. Yeah. They realized, oh, okay, now we get it. You're not part of the Cheech and Chong Club. And so it actually said.
Yeah. It's fascinating because I think at some level, that's kind of the life of an early stage entrepreneur, right? You're always going to be kind of venturing out in a domain that either raises some eyebrows or people kind of question. But, I think we're certainly moving into a phase in this industry where people are now, I get calls from friends who I never thought would call me and say, so tell me more about this CBD stuff and what level should I, like they're asking for advice.
Tell me about it, right?
It is fascinating. But I think that it's also kind of a marker, I think, for the industry that, look, this is now moving towards this kind of more mainstream movement or, consumer base. And now this gets quite complicated because it's now no longer just the pot community. Like you've got the soccer moms and you've got the retired population. You have, professionals out, like the marketing, the branding, the product development now has to get much more sophisticated as we move into these phases, which is good. I mean, it opens up a lot of opportunity. So tell us a little bit about Women Grow in terms of what the goal of the goal of the organization is, how it's set up right now. What do things look like? What are your plans for 2019? I would love to hear a little bit about where things are going with Women Grow.
Sure. So with Women Grow, and the reason why I loved it is, they attract professional women, right? So it's women at every level, whether you're an entrepreneur or someone who's looking to work at a cannabis company, which is wonderful because we'd like to see more women in C-suite roles as well as on boards. Yep. And so your conversation with Jane West, I was so excited about that because she birthed a brilliant idea. Like, what better than to get women together to network, to come together for education, to empower each other, and really inspire us to push this industry and this entire movement forward. And, from that idea, it really launched into markets across the country, as well as an annual leadership summit, which for the first time will be held on the East Coast. And there's a reason why. I believe Jane may have even mentioned that we're holding it in Washington, D.C., and that's really exciting. Yeah. And that says a lot about the direction of the industry overall. Yeah. So what we do is we have markets that are across the country led by our market leaders who are holding these monthly meetings. But in addition to their monthly meetings, they're also holding smaller meetings throughout the month, whether through education. We've had job fairs. In New York, they've actually held a speed networking, which I thought was the most brilliant thing. You had 4 minutes and 20 seconds to sort of speed networking, of course, because we're going to stay within the whole theme of
well
it.
Played.
But it was wonderful because people were able to do this networking, 12 rounds of it. And they sort of walked away with business cards with people that they seriously wanted to follow up with, right? And so you know how it is when you go to these networking events and you're kind of, in addition to that, we have webinars. This week, actually, we're doing cannabis and boomers. So the baby boomer community is really coming forward in this industry from the medical side, but also from the professional side. Yeah. Cannabis is really unique. It's the first industry where boomers are not being aged out. They're actually being welcomed because of their professional experience. And I think that that's key because at this point, we're still really early on. This industry is still maturing. We need all hands on deck. No one is too young or too old at this point to contribute to the growth of and development of this industry. And so we're doing a webinar with MJ Freeway based on their recent report about the boomer community in cannabis.
Yeah.
And Florida, the boomer community is one of the top consumers of cannabis, whether for recreational or medical. So these are the sort of forward-thinking educational platform that we're looking to grow out in 2019, as well as our monthly networking events and holding our leadership summit, which will be in Washington, D.C. this June. And again, it says a lot about what's happening on the East Coast because our leadership summit has been held in Denver for the last 4 years.
Yep.
So it says that really D.C., I think it's a special place, right?
Yeah.
It's the nation's capital, and we're going there to really have this conversation around the industry. So we're super excited about it.
Yeah, no, that's exciting. I think it does. It really marks, I think, that the development, the expansion of the industry, I mean, not only to the East Coast, but I think at a federal level. I mean, I think this is fairly quickly becoming a federal issue, or at least a federal level conversation, figuring out how do we really make this work at a national level for the industry. And, we're already global. It's kind of this funny inverted situation. We have all these developed states, this global industry, and we have nothing happening at the federal level. So at some point it's going to happen.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I was just agreeing. Yes.
So I know you're in the New York area here. Any thoughts? I know everything's moving very quickly, and depending on when the episode goes live here, everything may have changed dramatically. But based on what you see here, any thoughts on what's happening New York, New Jersey community in terms of, legalization and stuff?
Yeah. So another great question. So I'll touch on Women Grow and bring it back, and you'll see a full circle. So Jane West launched Women Grow in Denver, Colorado. Our current leadership, our chairwoman is from Washington, D.C., our CEO based in New Jersey, and I'm in New York.
Got it.
And there's so much cannabis activity happening within those, just from the District of Columbia to New Jersey to New York. Now, New York being the sort of financial capital of the U.S., I think pretty much everyone knew that our governor was not going to be outdone by New Jersey's governor pushing for adult use. As well as, we're in this tri-state area. So Connecticut is moving aggressively forward, looking to do full legalization this year. And so I believe from what we're hearing in New York is that they're looking, sometime around spring, summer, that this will happen. Yeah. We expected New Jersey to be fully adult use, or at least would have passed by now, but they're taking sometime this first quarter. But that says a lot about what's coming down the pike, especially in this early half of the year. Pennsylvania not too far behind them as well. So that's why, back to our leadership summit, it's so important that we are bringing it to the East Coast, because for the longest time, they were only just talking about Massachusetts, right, in its program. But now we're beginning to see all of these other Northeast states that are saying, hey, don't forget about us. And to your point about federal legalization, I think, we're at 33 medical states and 10 adult use. Yeah, I think those numbers are going to change significantly, especially through this year into next year. So there's a lot of talk of full legalization, especially. New York is very excited about it, and I understand why. I find there are people who are looking to do a lot of business in this industry in the city and in the state.
No, exciting times for everyone involved. Gia, this has been a great conversation. I've enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. I've had a lot of fun. If people want to find out more about you, about Women Grow, what's the best way to get more information?
Sure. So for Women Grow, I absolutely say please find us and even sign up for our newsletter. You can find us at womengrow.com and follow us across all of our platforms on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and on LinkedIn. Those are our great resources, and we also send out newsletters of what's going on. For me, I tend to be very active on social media because, to your point, where you have your former colleagues and family members that are asking questions, and they want 5 minutes of your time, and that turns into an hour, 2 hours of everyone wanting to get a piece of knowledge. I'm very active on social media for those purposes.
Yeah.
So I actually have from my great aunts,
That's great,
believe it or not, to my on LinkedIn and on Instagram and Twitter, reading about the articles that I'm posting. And so you can find me on LinkedIn as Gia Moron, or on Twitter and Instagram as Gia, that's GIA_VM. And I really put that information out there because I do understand how overwhelming it is. Like, where do you begin? And so I just share information, hoping that it helps to further their education knowledge about it.
Perfect. I will make sure that all those links are in the show notes here so people can click through and get to them. Gia, this has been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I'm looking forward to keeping in touch and seeing how things go, both federally and in the tri-state area here. And we will keep in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Bruce. I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to Thinking Outside the Bud with business coach Bruce Eckfeldt. To find a full list of podcast episodes, download the tools and worksheets, and access other great content, visit the website at thinkingoutsidethebud.com. And don't forget to sign up for the free newsletter at thinkingoutsidethebud.com/newsletter.